welcome to another episode of Whiteboard. My name is Harshit and I'm the Director of Business Alliance at White Labs. We are a digital agency specializing in SaaS and e-commerce this year. And I've got Mark with me. He's a co-founder and CEO of ScreenCloud, a global digital signage platform empowering more than 10K businesses to share meaningful content through screens. A big welcome to you, Mark, and I'm so happy to host you today.
Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Now, before we dive into all the awesome things you do in ScreenCloud, would love to know, and our viewers will definitely appreciate this, a little bit about you and your professional journey, because we look into a lot of other businesses as well. So yeah, please.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting to hear because most entrepreneurs, even if it's like a newer company, their actual backstory of how they got there really tells you the story of the person. In my case, I graduated from university in the year 2000, which was an interesting time. The dot-com boom and soon to be bust was going on. The web was pretty new. And I had a real interest in IT. So I started off in IT consulting. And actually, there was a big drive to bring people who didn't have a classic IT background, which I didn't. I actually studied economic and social history at university. So how did I end up here? At that time, there was something called the Y2K bug. You may have you've never heard of it. Then there was a flood of need for IT specialists to come in and training. So I started in corporate IT for PricewaterhouseCoopers before they sold to IBM. But then during the tech crash, lost a job there. And then that actually took me back into the agency life. And I joined a digital agency, which was working mainly in the public sector. So they actually still had clients at the time. And that's where I met my two co-founders, David and Luke. And then a couple of years later, we started our own company. It was basically a digital agency designing and building websites. And then later, web apps, mobile apps, and things like that. And we ran that for about 13 years, a cash flow business. And then it's still alive. So the agency was called Cogent. And we actually acquired another agency along the way. We acquired an agency, I think it was in 2011, called Thin Martian, who was mainly working with Microsoft. And we actually acquired that, grew that, and then sold that. So that's still going. So Thin Martian still exists. You can go and check thinmartian.com and you see some of the old work. Some of our work's actually still on their case study page, which is interesting. And we work for people like British Airways, Nestle, obviously Microsoft was a big one. And then about halfway through that journey, the agency journey, we started to use the profit that we generated and actually invest in our own products. So we started building products on the side, like had a small apps team that was building them. And they were strapped and profitable. Some of them completely failed and some of them were reasonably successful. And we learned how to really build that product muscle and actually, rather than just delivering projects, actually learn how to also market and grow digital products. And again, we got in quite early on the App Store and we had quite a lot of success there because we were really early on the App Store. We had 20 million downloads and a lot of revenue coming from that. So that was good. We sold most of those products off over time after generating revenue. And then ScreenCloud really was one of those side projects, which started in around 2015. Actually, it's when we officially incorporated, although the side project started a bit earlier. We saw a huge opportunity here and decided to just go all in on that. Raised some independent money, spun ScreenCloud out as a separate company, and then really the rest is history. We've been growing that since then.
That's brilliant. And so what was the idea behind? What was the problem that you were trying to solve or opening that you see when you were launching ScreenCloud altogether?
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying that the problem changes over time, right? So if you have to say that in the context of 2014, 2015, what was the problem we're trying to solve? And now today, in the context of 2023, what are we trying to solve? It has evolved, although there is a common thread.
Yeah.
So I suppose that if you go right back to the beginning, as web developers, which is what we were basically, we didn't know how to build anything for screens. The screen was like this forgotten landscape. And in fact, what is the original screen? It is in fact the TV, right? That's the first screen anyone will have had in their life, going back to when TV first came to fruition before computers, personal computing.
Sure.
And yet anyone working in the digital sphere doesn't really know how to work with screens. And the reality is it's very difficult. It's a highly fragmented hardware market. There's no common standards between the major manufacturers like Samsung and LG. And if you asked a web developer to do it, they'd have to learn something new. So our real mission was to bring the web to screens and to enable this to be simple and easy to deploy web-based applications on screen. That was like what we saw. The second thing that we saw was that because of the hardware world being highly commoditized with low margin, on the digital signage side, the professional digital signage side, they were actually putting out units that were very expensive. Now, there was a good use case for those units. Maybe it's 24/7. Maybe it needs to be weather resistant or even resistant to like vandalism because it's out in public. But not every TV screen in business needs to be on all the time and needs to be secured against extreme weather or extreme people in some cases. So why couldn't a normal TV be used? There's no margin in that. So what we do is we say, let's not approach this as a hardware problem, let's approach this as a software problem. So that's when we took new products on the market like Amazon Fire TV and said, could this $40 computer actually make a screen work for business? And the answer was yes, to some degree, not for everything. And that opened up the market to people who previously would have had to spend a huge amount of capital expenditure on professional screens when it just wasn't necessary. And that's really where things began. And that's really where the flywheel started to begin.
Gotcha. And what sets you apart from like in today's age from other digital signage solutions in the market, and particularly catering to the multi-location enterprises and deskless frontline workforces?
Oh, right. Yeah. So the actual digital signage software market is quite flooded. And in fact, actually, if you look out there through Google or whatever, you might find hundreds of basically software solutions saying that they do the same thing. So the reality is that there's a couple of things. There's only really a handful of players who are actually like the leaders in this space. There's a lot of very small niche ones. There's nothing wrong with that. But what you tend to find is there might be quite a small technical team. They probably haven't got really the scope of the resources to build a fully fledged solution. Fundamentally, the big problem with digital signage is that it doesn't work very well. Historically, it was either very complicated or on-premise, so it wasn't cloud-based, and reliability was a huge issue. So you had either blue screen of death, black screens, frozen screens, whatever it might be. And so most IT teams around the world who've tried to use screens in the past have found that there's a big reliability issue. So if you're going to build trust with customers at scale, it has to work. Now, it's actually much more complicated than it might think. Not only do you have the fragmented hardware landscape, a load of different operating systems, some of which were never really designed for screen. Like Windows is used on screens, but Windows was never really designed for screens.
Yeah.
So you're fighting against the operating systems often. In addition, screens tend to go in public environments that actually quite often have very poor connectivity, very poor Wi-Fi, and even the Wi-Fi connector is behind a screen which might be up on a big concrete wall. So connectivity is an issue, and you cannot rely on that as well, which is another part of the reliability stack. So and then the other big part of this is the web experience, the embedded web experience on screens is usually massively out of date. So you might be running like kind of versions of Chrome from 4 years ago, which means a web developer now needs to make changes to the application in order for it to run and render correctly. So if you kind of take all of these things together, it's actually extremely complicated. And that's just getting anything to look good, anything to work. Beyond that, you now need to give tools and support to those customers in terms of how do we enable them to get content up onto screen in a screen-friendly format, which most content hasn't been designed for. And it goes on and on, really, in terms of what the challenges are. So I suppose what sets ScreenCloud apart initially is that we've taken on all of these major challenges seriously and come up with a reliable and cost-effective solution against them. So in terms of differentiating, we obviously have a robust and modern solution. When we looked at the market of like probably the more serious players in the market, most of them are focused on what we just describe as screens that sell. So commercial facing screens. That could be outdoor advertising, menu boards in quick serve restaurants like McDermott's, etc., or in retail and airports and transportation. Basically screens which are asking you to buy things, right? And that's where most of the market is today and where most of the dollars are spent. And it works for them, clearly. They wouldn't be putting screens up everywhere if it wasn't working. However, as a web developer, that's less interesting for us because in a retail environment, you might just have 10 videos which are just looping around showing you the latest products. So the screen needs to be internet connected, but doesn't necessarily need to be web generative in terms of what the content is. So when we look at screens that communicate, and so by that we mean that could be a college campus communicating to students and lecturers, etc., or it could be an office to knowledge workers, or it could be in a manufacturing or logistics plant where majorities like deskless or frontline workers, even people working in retail in the back office, the content that goes on those screens needs to be web generated. And I'll explain why. you're going to see that screen multiple times every single day. That is inside your environment. You're going to see it all the time. If that is a looping series of images and videos within an hour, that's out of date. So it has to be data driven. It has to be web driven and basically generate that content on the fly. So it's a source of truth, but it's also updating at a sufficient frequency to actually warrant you looking at it. So we focus on screens that communicate, and our whole product roadmap really is focused there on how we do these integrations to enable the data-driven content to be up on their screens.
Oh, that's brilliant. And what are the key challenges you have faced with your? Let's talk about marketing. What are the key challenges you have faced with your marketing, and how have you overcome them?
Again, I suppose I'd have to say, so the business has evolved, right? From at the very early days, we were going for quite high number of transactions, but with a low ACV, right? Because our product wasn't mature, it was at the cheaper end. That's how we got going, and we still do that, right? Now, with that, you need to build basically a marketing machine, because you can't do that sort of individually one by one. It just economically doesn't make sense. So I think the smart things we did there is we invested heavily in content and good quality content. Most people don't know what digital signage is. In fact, back in the day, people usually thought that meant like DocuSign, signing a PDF. So people don't know what it is. So often the people, especially if they've never done it before, which we were opening up the market. So what are they Googling? They're basically saying, how to put my PowerPoint on a screen, how to put my menu board on a TV or whatever. So there was a lot of long tail content of people just looking for the answer. So we did video content on YouTube, because that kind of how-to stuff, people go to YouTube to look for how to do something. And then we also did a lot of how-to content around that. So even though we were very small at the beginning, we were publishing at least 4 articles of quality a month and building up SEO and ranking around that. And that worked very effectively, and still, to be honest, still to this day works very well. It is the gift that keeps on giving, but you've got to invest time, and you guys know all about this, right? As we've gone more upmarket with our enterprise offerings, so I said that machine is still running and still doing quite well. We may have taken our eye off the ball of it a bit the last few years, but I think we've got a new team focused there, kind of how I explained earlier, which is focused really on the performance side. So we have another team that's focused more on the enterprise side, and that is a much more nuanced and subtle approach, where you've got multi-stakeholders in IT, in internal comms, HR, operations, whatever it might be. And we're probably going to have like maybe somewhere between 7 and even 20 touch points with that customer. So we've got our kind of white papers, we've got webinars, account-based marketing, and then it's working with our sales team in terms of generating leads and going after target accounts, etc. So it's a bit of a barbell. We have 2 different types of machine that we're building. We're probably a bit more mature over on the marketing funnel inbound, let Google do the work for you type thing. But we've, over the last couple of years, been building out this kind of more enterprise sufficient, sales oriented ABM approach.
That's nice. And it's always good to have multiple channels working in your favor than just leveraging one. So yeah, plus your strategy can change as well. Your target, the business size that you're targeting.
I would go wider than just marketing. You've always got to be looking ahead, and what works for you today might not necessarily work for you tomorrow, or you might cap it out completely. And the one thing about SEO, which is I suppose the downside of SEO, is that you can't tell the world to Google more. So it's not a lever you can pull. You can't say, unless suddenly whatever your subject matter suddenly becomes like the spotlight of the world suddenly goes on it. And then how many people were like really Googling about AI 2 years ago compared to now, right? It's going to be radically different. But basically, and again, you really probably can't control that. So SEO captures what's the demand that's out there, but it doesn't really help with generating that demand initially. And that's where eventually you've got to go out and start telling your story to the world as well.
Definitely. Again, so you can basically focus much more on the branding efforts, broadcasting. You use multiple channels, social channels, whatnot.
We haven't done too much on social, but LinkedIn works well for us. And I personally use LinkedIn heavily. I push a lot of content out on LinkedIn related to our product and what we're doing, and that definitely generates interest. And it's interesting, actually, people are more inclined to listen to the CEO and founder than listen to the brand channel. And I think we've seen that. The famous one is that Tesla doesn't have a marketing team, allegedly. I'm not sure they probably do. But basically, Elon's reach is way greater than Tesla's brand reach. And I think even though that's like maybe just an exception. I don't think it's an exception to the rule. I think even a podcast like this, I could just put on our official spokesperson for ScreenCloud, or you could talk to me and I can tell you what really happened or what's really going on. And they're not going to be like conflicting.
Yeah.
That strategy is a strategy that I set, so it shouldn't conflict.
Yeah.
But you're going to get a bit more real talk probably because I can afford to give you the history. I can tell you why.
Yeah, definitely. And it makes sense. And for you also leveraging, because you mainly focus B2B, and especially now the focus is on enterprise more. So I'm sure like LinkedIn is a wise choice to market. So makes sense.
And there is an interesting point around that because I think, especially with enterprise sales,
Yeah.
I think that the term partner is overused when you're talking about sales because ultimately you are selling. And so you could be like, oh, we're really partnering with our customers. It sounds almost a bit cliche, maybe even a bit sleazy in some way. But I think there is a degree of truth to it. And the truth is that, especially with something like digital signage, once you roll this out to maybe hundreds of locations, maybe thousands of screens, this is a huge undertaking for our customers. So that relationship is not going to be 1 year old. It's going to be probably minimum 5 years. And that's, and to be honest, often probably longer because it's a huge effort to change. So I think you do, when you're considering the sale, you obviously need to validate that the product is where you want it to be going today. But you want to know the direction of travel that business is taking, because in 5 years' time, decisions I've made where I allocate budget on product and on R&D, if that doesn't align with what you're going to ultimately want and need, then maybe you've picked the wrong vendor.
Yeah.
And so I think that is where there is a degree of partnership. And I think that on LinkedIn, I have the opportunity to throw out my ideas, and not just my ideas, obviously the ideas that are of the team. I'm just really the spokesperson for the collective of the business.
Yeah.
Some of them are my own thoughts, and a lot of them are what I learn from my people and from my customers actually as well. They generate a lot of ideas for me.
Yeah.
If I can then articulate that and put it together and say, this is where we're going, then
Yeah.
actually I think it's important.
Makes sense. And you mentioned a very good point. So you're keeping your customers engaged through LinkedIn. I would love to know what are other activities or strategies that you do to keep your customers loyal and engaged.
Yeah, I would just stress that's my personal channel. There are more official channels at ScreenCloud than that. So actually, this is another interesting one that if you don't get this kind of all tied up, you can end up bombarding your customer with,
Yeah.
so give me an NPS score, now give me a rating, now here's a newsletter, and hey, I'm your account manager. So it actually, the touch points can get overwhelming if you don't start to get your act together a bit. You're either going to leave them in deafening silence or probably overdo it, and actually getting it right is probably the tricky bit. I think we often forget that like, basically existing customers don't go back to your website, right? They just don't really. They will go through your knowledge base though. And I think actually your knowledge base and your support channels are indeed a big touch point, because that is, often how you're talking and interfacing with that customer. Obviously your success team as well. I think honestly, one of the best ways to keep customers abreast of what's going on is in-app. Actually using in-app channels to surface features, because obviously you're catching the right person at the right time. Our customers are not logged into ScreenCloud all day, every day, right? They'll probably go in and maybe make their updates in a block of time. Maybe some of them will be once a day, but probably mostly once a week, something like that.
Yeah.
And to be honest, do you really want to hear about ScreenCloud on the Tuesday that you're not working on it? Probably not that interesting. So we do have email newsletters and things, but I think most of the engagement we get is actually from within the product itself, and then surfacing features at the appropriate time where someone might be actually interested in hearing more. A huge amount of in-app origination. I think often today I use the Whoop band. I'm a proud customer, and actually I have a small investment in the company as well, very small. And actually most of the in-app kind of conversion and upselling happens when I'm using the product, and then really on email. And I think that's, if you've got the eyeballs on your product at the time, like that is the best time to talk to them.
That's right.
And I think in marketing, we often think of them as other channels. Now, obviously, those other channels are good for new customers who have no experience of your product. But sometimes I think we overthink those channels as ways of talking to our existing customers when we've got the best channel of all in front of our eyes.
Definitely. And one more thing, Mark, because you're serving a wide range of industries, right, and businesses, I would love to know how you adopt your marketing strategies to reach and resonate with these different target audience. I'm sure like there must be a lot of prioritization and all of those things happening. Just a small example, if you have to just create a content piece and you have like, you all work with limited resources. So what exactly his target audience would you prioritize and how exactly does that happen?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's hard. The answer is I don't have a phenomenally good answer, but the answer I can give is the honest one. So when ScreenCloud began, I loved the fact that, to be honest, digital signage could be used for almost any business in the world, almost any use case. And trust me, I probably have worked with a customer on almost every single use case you could imagine. Genuinely, we've got over 10,000 of them, and then that's just the customers we've actually landed, let alone the ones we've actually spoken to, right? So you can imagine it's just far and wide. And I loved it. I loved the randomness. I loved learning about new things. And then as we were scaling, I realized this is actually really difficult because my team's then starting to have very random. Your sales team's going to be better at selling if each customer kind of acts and talks the same. But if they're completely different each time, they're just not going to generate the learnings quick enough to be good. And so it starts to work against you. I suppose I'd say two things, really. On one side, in defense of a massive array of use cases, content is content, right? A JPEG on a screen, an MP4 on a screen, a web page on a screen, technically is the same thing. Now, what it actually says on the JPEG or the web page or the MP4, like that can have a completely random use case. But as a technical delivery platform, it doesn't really matter. And that's up to you what you want to say there. So the product, by its very nature and the kind of content that it's delivering is generic because there's really only so many content types that we have, right? Like the tail falls off pretty quick after about 10 types. However, for your marketing, I suppose then you've got to say, look, even though anyone could use this and benefit from it, like who's really getting the most benefit from it? And where is there a gap in the market where we can exploit? So that's why we took the bold decision to say, let's look at screens which are communication platforms. Screen as a communication delivery platform, not as a commercial platform. Because to be honest, those guys have done a great job. And yes, I'm sure it's in need of a bit more modernization and innovation, but it wasn't screaming for us to go over there. And to be honest, it's also not my background. It's not really, I'm not a retailer, right? Like I think you need to do that, you need to really understand that world. And I didn't, and our team didn't. So I suppose I cut off 80% of the market just by that. Now, if it's a small retail use case, a small QSR, then of course, ScreenCloud does a great job of that because it's a really nice, reliable platform. But at the enterprise level, it's probably not for you. So now I've cut my market down, but it's still pretty big because every business kind of needs to communicate to its people. So then I like, well, which are the businesses that have an urgent need for screens as a communication platform? And that's where the deskless and frontline worker industries come in, which is actually 80% of all the people employed are actually considered deskless. Knowledge workers are the minority. We often forget about this, but it's not normal for most of the world to sit down at a computer and work on Teams or Slack and email. Most of the world is out there doing stuff and they're not on a computer or a mobile device. And so the screen might be the only digital platform that they see and interface with. And therefore the urgency for what we do and their requirement is better. And then really at that point, you just look at what are the big segments that are large and that you've already got some good traction with. And we've already done very well in manufacturing and logistics. So we mainly focus around there, but we also do education and healthcare as probably number 3 and 4 as well.
Yeah. Well, what was the impact?
Ultimately, to answer your question properly, and therefore that's the content we create is against use cases.
Thanks, wow. I would want to know what is the impact business-wise during pandemic?
Yeah, good question. That was scary. March, you know what? In the whole history of ScreenCloud, March 2020 was the most amount of revenue we had ever put through the business. We were really going on it. We were growing so well and everything was just going so well. And then suddenly it wasn't. Basically, COVID closed the doors on pretty much every single customer that we had. It was really scary. We went backwards in revenue, as you would expect. Some of our businesses that we served, especially the smaller ones, went bust during that time. Obviously, a lot of people didn't have the need and money was scarce because initially, obviously, all of the COVID support, financial support, that wasn't like definitely going to come, right? No one knew what the government were going to do. And obviously, we're in multiple countries, and mainly America. We did a lot of revenue protection. And what we did was we basically said, look, if you're not getting value from the screens, we don't want your money, but don't churn. So we said, look, we will just credit your account. And what that did is it meant that whenever they renewed, the credits would apply, and it softened the blow, the financial blow, rather than just say, we're going to give you your money back. We said we'd credit your account, because otherwise we'd basically have gone bust.
Yeah.
Revenue went backwards, but only by about 7%, which is a miracle. And I think it's because of the revenue protection, because we were proactive to say to the customers, we know you're not getting value from our product, and therefore we think we need to do something favorable. That was good. Also, a lot of customers said to us, look, we don't want to churn because we don't think we're going to be stuck indoors forever. And when we come back, we're going to need you, and we need you to survive. So actually, a lot of people turned down the credit and said, thank you, but we know that we're a much bigger company than you, like a big multinational. We don't need your credit. Please take that credit and stay alive, which I thought was amazing. So it was hard, but we actually modeled for a 20% drop in revenue, and we only went to 7. Then it bottomed out and sort of went flat. And then we started to grow. And the areas that we started to grow again in were industries where they couldn't shut down, right? Like manufacturing and logistics. And that's how we picked up those customers. And therefore we learned more about that world. And that's what got that bit going, because a lot of frontline and deskless workers couldn't stop.
Yeah.
And so actually for those guys, the screens became super important, especially when management teams couldn't travel to the sites themselves. How else are you going to communicate? By screen. So it actually ended up generating our greatest use case. But yeah, I'm not going to lie, that was like super, I won't swear, but it was scary.
What are the main KPIs do you prioritize for your customers and deliver to your customers, basically, in order to basically report on the effectiveness of the campaigns that they run? Or
Yeah. So basically, what's the ROI of screens, I think is what you're probably getting at. So I would say, again, it's another hard question. I say there's 3 tiers to ROI when you're using screens.
yeah.
So tier 1 would be basically saving time and money. So if with ScreenCloud, we are demonstrably more reliable than legacy systems. And so we predominantly sell to the IT buyer, right? Because we're part of the IT network. So we are, not to overuse that word again, we partner with our IT team, because if a screen goes down in a business, the people don't complain to us, they complain to their IT team. Hey guys, the screen's off. So in that sense, we genuinely are a partner, even though they're obviously paying for us. And for them, their reputation's on the line. Any IT system that IT is supporting, it needs to be on their network, it needs to be secure, it needs to have the capabilities to do what the business needs of it, and they need to be able to support it. So the fact that screens often get turned off and go down, and then people need to send engineers out into the field, that costs a lot of money. If you can do all of that remotely, or just have it not happen at all, or hardly ever, then you're not sending engineers in the field. That saves you a ton of time. So there's we have one of the ambulance services in the UK uses us. They actually looked at their engineering ticket list, and they saw that they saved 350 hours in the first year of using ScreenCloud compared to a previous system. So there's that aspect to it as well. The other aspect of time and money is that often we are replacing bits of paper stuck on a notice board. The actual cost of printing and then posting and then getting someone to go and change it and then checking that they've changed it is actually quite high. And I've heard in the US that could even be up to $600 per poster, including all of those costs, which seems extraordinary, but I can see why, especially if you have to double check that it's even happened or not. And then maybe you need to make an update to it and send that poster again, because you're like, oh no, it's out of date. So you can see there's a big efficiency cost just by using it. The second area of ROI, I would say, is most of the content that we're putting up on a screen already exists inside the business, but it exists inside of knowledge worker tools. So it might be content in Teams or SharePoint or Excel or Power BI. So it's in a silo. It's behind a login. It's a knowledge worker tool. And your deskless frontline workers, they just don't see that. They don't have an IT login. They don't have an email address, right? They don't have a company email address. So what we're doing is say, let's get that content that lives there. Where it's useful and valuable, let's project that content up onto screen. So we're extending the ROI of the content you're already creating and maximizing its surface area to the 100% of the organization rather than just the 20% potentially. So again, you've already made that investment. We're just extending that investment out for you. And we do all of that often automated. So it's like an automated feed rather than a manual process. The third bit of ROI, which I think is probably where the root of your question was coming from, was basically in the effectiveness of using screens for either productivity, behavior change, health and safety, that kind of thing. That is trickier because a lot of our customers are new to this and they don't really do the big analysis piece that you would like to see whether this behavior change really has happened. But some of them do. And I can give you a couple of examples here. So we recently had an industrial customer in the Midwest of the States use the screens for a campaign for benefit enrollments. And they saw a 45% uptick in benefit enrollments on time because of the screen campaign compared to what they would typically expect when doing enrollment previously, which has been massively helpful. So it shows you that it's pretty, the science of it's pretty obvious. It's basically, if you make people much more aware, if you remind them at the right time, at the right place to do something, the chances are they're more likely to do it.
Yeah.
Another corporate customer of mine, I won't be able to name who they are, but they're very large on the West Coast in their corporate HQ, put screens on every second floor and then screens not on the other ones, right? So half the building had screens, half of them didn't, as a test for 3 months, just a pilot project, because they wanted to see, does this actually work before they went and rolled it out, not just to the whole building, but to the whole country. And then they did like a pulse survey based on the type of content that they'd been showing on those screens about 3 months later. And what was interesting was, so the recall rates of information averaged mostly around, just for argument's sake, about 30%. Obviously, there were different levels of recall rates, but basically, most people could remember about a third of the content. Right? That was the default. So sorry, that was the people without screens.
Okay.
On the floors that had screens, that recall rate jumped up to more like 80% or 70%, right? Depending on the content, except not for all content. Some content, it made no difference whatsoever. Other content, it had a radical recall rate. And the main difference was really how simple was it to understand the message. So if it was a big complicated dashboard, it probably made no difference. If it had 3 numbers on it, people could remember them. If it was like promoting an event, remember to do this by that time, it really worked. If it was a really nuanced explaining a new business strategy, it didn't work at all. So there's certain content which you just got to make it really simple and snackable. So if you glance at the screen, you see it, your brain is going to remember it. And if you see that hundreds of times potentially over 3 months, you're not going to know why, but you are going to remember it because it's tapping into your subconscious cognition. And this is what screens is all about. There is a science to this that most people don't understand. But when I explain this, you get what I'm saying, right? Your eyes are picking up way more information than you're probably really conscious of, and you're learning, right? And so if I just put more information into your world every day in these small, delicate nudges, and I make it clear and simple for you to understand, then you're going to understand it. And that's really the kind of mission that I'm trying to spread, really. Because like, we don't use screens well enough. And my job is to explain why. But if you do, and you do it in the right way, it'll have a massive effect.
That's really interesting. So you are basically serving more than 10K customers now. More than 100K screens are powered by the organization. What's the average lifetime value per customer for you?
Again, you have to cohort them because if you do an average, it comes up with a slightly weird one. So if a customer's using us for 1 or 2 screens, you're probably looking at like average lifetime, maybe 2-3 years. Sometimes they go bust because they can be quite small customers, like credit card fail. And then maybe the person who was in the business that was using the screens has left the business. They haven't handed over. So you see a bit more churn and frothiness at the very low end, a couple of screens. But if you're talking like, I've got 500 screens running ScreenCloud across 100 locations. You know, to be honest, we've only been going since 2015, and I still think the lifetime value is longer than that. I would say it's probably 5 years plus. And when I speak to customers,
and if you have to put a number, like monetary number,
for enterprise, just for argument's sake, for enterprise, I'd put 5 years, but I think it's probably further than that. It's just that we haven't been going long enough on enterprise for me to tell you. But when I speak to a customer who's replacing a legacy system that they probably hate, right? They've often said, oh, it's unreliable. We don't like it. How long have you had it? They're like, oh, since 2010. And I'm like, so just a minute, you've been paying for this thing for 13 years and you don't like it. But they're like, yeah, but it's a massive pain to change. So to be honest, there's something to be said for like software, which has this kind of hardware component. It makes it a bit more complex at the beginning, but it also locks you in. Not that you want to be locked into a customer that doesn't like you, but it means that churning out of ScreenCloud at scale is painful. And that would be the same for any of my competitors too.
Yeah.
So you got to really screw up to lose them, basically.
Right, Mark. We're coming to an end, and I would love to have a quick rapid fire with you now. Are you ready for that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. What one word do you want people to associate you with?
Screens.
Wow.
I'm the screen guy.
Are you a private person or not?
I am a introverted person with extrovert tendencies. So I'm giving out a lot of energy into this interview. And that probably sounds like I'm quite extroverted, especially if you see me on stage or something. But the reality is that this drains me in an enjoyable way. And I need to go and be quiet after this for an hour and recharge my battery. So I would say that I am a private person, and I'm increasingly becoming more private as I get better known. But I'm very happy to be very public about my passion for screens and screens as a medium, and less so about just things. People don't need to know me that well to know
Yeah.
that my message matters.
That's right. I'm pretty much with you in that sense. I also need some quiet time after a long meeting and things. So I usually take not more than 30 minutes all day, but yeah.
Yeah, a normal meeting I probably wouldn't need to recharge, but I'm giving quite a lot of energy out at the moment.
That makes sense. Any funny nickname your parents or friends or work colleague used to call you?
Well, actually, my nickname is, and even in Slack, I'm still called this. It's just McD. I mean, my surname's McDermott, but when my first job, someone just started calling me McD, and it's just always stuck. So some people don't even know my name's Mark. They're like, "Oh, it's just McD, McD." I don't know. Now I'm 44. It feels a bit weird. That made more sense when I was 21.
What was the last Google search?
What was my last Google search? Oh, probably Black Friday TV deals because I'm buying a new TV.
What's something you could eat for a week straight?
Oh, Indian food. I actually was born in Dubai, and my nanny was actually from Kerala, and my mum asked her to feed me this really boring baby food that was like fashionable at the time, that was like high in nutrients, but it tasted terrible. And she tasted it, and she had a baby the same age as me, and so she just basically fed me baby curries, and I literally could eat that forever. I love it.
That's good. Okay. All right, Mark. It was fun talking to you and learned a lot from you. And yeah, thank you so much for all the time, all the wisdom that you shared in this session. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for the engaging conversation and the intelligent questions. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.